the companies that spend during a recession come out 2 to 3x their competitors who stopped prior. The best example is that Post was the big cereal brand. They cut back during the Great Depression, and Kellogg's kept spending, and Kellogg's came out at 250% more sales or something. If you're a large enough brand, and you can say, hey, look, like, what's more important, us hitting, a break even for the next year and a half, or us losing a bit but coming out way ahead of our competition? Because there's no question, when recessions happen, opportunity increases. This is where all these major companies came from, is during recessionary times. That's how innovation happens. That's how growth happens. That's where ad costs go down. That's where consumers are looking for that next thing, spending more time on their phones, or et cetera, et cetera. So it's a massive opportunity.
Thousands of people have jump-started their TikTok content strategy using Coley's TikTok Creative Brief template. That's because it has all the steps for successful creator collaborations and best practices to create fun and engaging TikToks. If you haven't grabbed your copy yet, don't worry. Coley just dropped a brand new version of their popular template filled with even more tips and insights to level up your TikTok game. Head to Coley.com/TikTok to download your free copy and start creating TikToks for your brand that people actually want to watch. Welcome to All Killer No Filler. My name's Eric, and I am here with the Pilothouse founding team, Dave, Jeff, and Kyle. It's funny, it was probably 2 years ago, a couple months ago, we did the very first ever podcast, Pilothouse podcast at that time, where we talked a little bit. I think it was called How to Advertise in a Recession, I think, or no, How to Advertise in a Global Pandemic, essentially, is what that first episode was called of the podcast ever. Look back on it very fondly. And so I just thought maybe it's time to update this All Killer No Filler episode and release a how to advertise in a recession. Now, let's start with that. First of all, just from a broad sense, Jeff, you're probably the guy that pays closest attention to these global trends. Are we officially in a recession yet, would you say?
I think I don't think anyone knows what the hell's going on right now, to be honest. We're in a weird time. I mean, consumer savings is way up because of the pandemic. I don't think I was looking at some chart, we haven't had this level of savings since the 40s, I think it is. And consumer spending is still high, but then we have inflation, which is,
consumer debt is also high too, and the opposite of savings.
Yes. But the job market's still hot as all hell. There's obviously tech layoffs and things like that, but for the most part, no one can get enough workers. Wages aren't going up as high as inflation's going up, blah, 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 blah. So we're in, I would say, I think the general consensus, at the very least, we're just in some level of uncharted waters.
It's interesting. Eric, you made reference of the pre-pandemic podcast. And in many ways, all you can do is prepare yourself, right? That's what strategy is, just preparing for any eventuality. I think it's safe to prepare for a difficult eventuality. That's what we were doing, pre-pandemic. I think everyone was. We all got very lucky in this industry. If it is if the recession comes on strong and gets worse, I think it's safe to say it won't be, a redo of those e-commerce glory days in the coming years. But that being said, I think the same process of preparing yourself and getting ready for that eventuality is all the same thing. So it's a good reflection on that point. What moved the needle back then likely could, be what we need to be focusing on this time.
I want to talk about the things and some of the steps that maybe brands can be taking, the things that we're doing with our brands to prepare. But I just want to even just reflect, since you brought it up too, on, that was March 2020, I think, when we did that, How to Advertise in a Pandemic. And I know, you kind of went into, as CEO and the founding team here, you kind of went into that year with this idea of, like, even though there was a lot of uncertainty, that you were going to kind of put some bets down, grow the business, really grow aggressively. Let's just check in a little bit for people that might not know, like, what's happened to Pilothouse in the 2 years since we did that podcast.
I say triple double. That's kind of our trajectory, and we're looking to keep that momentum strong. Obviously, nowadays it's gonna be about the how, right? How can we create that momentum? And that means, in my opinion, just my view on that is staying focused on what matters, right? Just not losing sight of what makes a business survive any day, recession or not. Are you acquiring customers profitably, right? Now, sure, there's some tech companies, SaaS companies that somehow don't have to live by those rules, but for most brands, most listeners here, it's are you acquiring customers profitably? Are you able to sell your product effectively? Right? Pilothouse aligns to the ability to do that. And so, as a brand owner, as a if you're an e-commerce manager, whatever you are, I think that now more than ever, you just got to reconnect with those things. And that means sometimes making some sacrifices, right? Sacrifices that we at Pilotos are willing to make. Sometimes takes you have to take the ego out of it, right? Sometimes you have to not care what other people think, how other people view you, and you just have to get the job done. And in this case, that is selling your products profitably. And if you can do that, you have to be like a cockroach through a war, right? Is relentless focus on survival, food, water, shelter, reproduce, right? And as a business, that means being relentlessly focused on the things that are going to allow you to survive, and that's generating cash flow, right? I mean, the question's always, should we pull back? I think the title of this is advertising in a recession, right? The big question is, should we pull back? Should we spend into it? Should we, create awareness so that one day in the future we can acquire those customers back? That's obviously possible for some businesses, but that's a big gamble, big risk for a lot of others. And I wouldn't advise it for some smaller brands who probably need to generate cash flow in the short term to keep their payroll going, right? To avoid layoffs and avoid some tough decisions.
Are we seeing any pullback in the market, like just in terms of like ad competition? It's funny, on the D2C side, we're seeing sort of record low lead costs right now, which back to pre-pandemic levels or pandemic levels, we're seeing our kind of lead costs come down. And I'm wondering if part of that has to do with flight from the market or flight from competition on these paid social platforms. Are we seeing any of that so far from the paid social side in terms of lack of competition?
I can comment real quickly, specifically like with the Meta, Facebook, Instagram team. Our our click costs are like back to, on average, they're back in and around kind of where it was like a year and a half or two ago. And so I don't know if like you can attribute that specifically to big brands pulling out or holding cash, but and also like there's likely declining user base and things like that too. So there's a couple like pressure systems there. But even with declining user bases, people, swinging over to TikTok or just gardening, whatever they're doing. In my case, click costs are coming down. It does feel that way.
If you look at the predictions for Facebook revenue, Snap, Pinterest, Google revenue, they're not predicting a flood of advertising dollars into the market, right? They're predicting a slowdown in growth. So, I mean, that in itself just tells us that we should, and we most likely will, if we end up, and I think there's a big if, but I think it's probably a logical if we end up in more of a traditional recession in terms of consumer spending dries up or lessens, we're gonna see less competition in the ad marketplaces. And I think there's again, like you just said, Eric, and like you just said, Kyle, I mean, that comes with big advantages, and the people that will succeed are the ones that can take advantage of that and say, okay, hey, I couldn't acquire users on Facebook before because it was just too expensive, but all of a sudden CPMs have dropped by 25%. All of a sudden it works for me. I'm going to dig into that. Even though consumer might be down, it might make up for it.
Well said, Jeff. And I think also looking at like your offering, like what is your actual product or service that you're selling, right? Like at the beginning of this chat, we talked about how consumer saving hasn't been this high since the 40s. At the same flip the coin on the other side, consumer debt's never been higher. But we've also been saying consumer debt's never been higher for the last 15, 20 years. It's just how it is. There's a marketplace of haves and have-nots, and that's really important. Like look at your offering and where you're at with the have and have nots, and give yourself confidence or insecurity, I suppose, around what you're actually trying to sell, because there are people that will still be buying through this. In every recession, there are always people that still buy. There's always people that will have money. It's which group will have that money and which won't. And in addition, I just read this article yesterday on like there's more people buying yachts than ever before. It's like record-setting yacht sales, right? We know the divide in our global economy, and I think just being aware of that and looking at your product looking at your placements and just staying on top of it. I remember when, you know, the 2 weeks leading up to the kind of like official pandemic, shutting down the office. Oh my God, are we all going to lose our jobs? Are we going to have to fire people? We all rallied together. And I remember that little uptick. I still remember, and I still remember Dave on a call, and he said, "No, we're going. Look at this." And I was like, "What are you talking about?" No, no, no. We're in fear mode right now, Dave. And he's like, "No, no, no. Look at this. It's ticking up." And the next day, he's like, "We're fucking going, boys." And we got behind that. And so you need to use data. Sure, be cautious, be aware, look at all these indicators, but make sure you're on top of what you're doing to make your decisions and be confident in your product. Find the right consumers, because there is going to be groups of people with money. You just have to get in front of them.
And for the and it's not like, it's not a total feast or famine. It's not haves and have-nots entirely. It's also for those that may not be in the yacht buying class. It's about crafting your offer to meet them where they are, and having, and offering discounts and promotions and things like that that really take that into account, that not everyone maybe has the disposable income they had before. Doesn't mean you're not going to reach them, but it might mean that you have to tailor your offer to reach them better.
Let's unpack that a little bit more, Eric, because that is a very practical strategy, right? Is if you are a brand where you've got consumers and they're deciding between your product and another product, switching brands is the task. They're still going to be buying your product, whether it's recession or not. Not your product, a product in your category. And so it's about, can you find a way to craft the offer to decrease the upfront cost while still profiting over that longer term to acquire a customer and generate profit, if not in the first purchase, in the second or third. So your funnel, your back end is important now more than ever, right? You need to make sure coming into this, your email is tight, your follow-up and your retargeting, your customer experience, right? What's that? Are you reaching out to your customers and saying, hey, thank you? Like, we know money is tight. Money is tight these days. We really want to express our appreciation. And they're going to say, holy shit, when was the last time I got a call like that? Right. So you got to find those ways to create that experience to drive those repeat purchases now more than ever.
I think that's a super relevant point too, Dave, and not just on in recessionary times, but we are in we've been in a data recession for the past year or 2 years since Apple's made its changes. Facebook's been changing the way they do things, and we don't have the same level of insights. The systems don't have the same algorithms they used to have, and it's not going to get better. It's going to get worse. So I think when times are good, and I think we can say that times are still good. People are still spending. The companies we're working with are
Biggest
still
Amazon Prime Day ever.
Yeah, like things
Right?
are still just going up, right? It now is the time to focus on those things that you should be, and like the first party data that Dave was referring to is one of the most important. The amount of people we see coming in that don't have that dialed, or at the very least are doing just a kind of the bare minimum because it's all they've ever had to do, because times have been so good with just you spend money on Facebook, it makes you more money. It's surprising, and I think that's one of those things that any brand that starts to focus more on that first party data, their SMS program, their email program, the retention of customers opposed to just the acquisition of customers, is going to be the one. They're going to be the ones that come out of the recession eventually on the other side in a much better footing than those that failed halfway through because they didn't have that set up.
Jeff, well said. Like if you're pulling back on customer acquisition when you're doing it, break even with out cash flow issues, and you're pulling back now out of kind of worry of what will happen. You need to double down while it's working in case something does go sideways here, and you do that before things do turn. To Jeff's point, in collecting customer data and building that long-term vision, and a lot of you listeners have done that. But if you're profitable, you lean into it and you do it hard, and you do it right now.
Yeah, I agree. And we've been in you think about, back to the question to Dave about how has Pilothouse done in it. I think that it's not a surprise to anyone that, everyone in the direct to consumer e-commerce space has had this amazing wind behind their backs for the past 2 years. And I think people that expect that it's going to do that forever are wrong. And I think that's what we're trying to say today too, is that you have to always be adapting, always be adjusting, use that win to gain the momentum so that you can ride through the storm at the end of the day and you're still fine. It's the people that are doing the bare minimum during the win because it's easy that are going to just, fall flat.
Bingo, Jeff. Yeah, couldn't agree more. And so what would be some of the specific takeaways I see with regards to brands who maybe started in 2019 or before or even during 2020? Obviously, saw an amazing 1, 2, 3 years worth of progress, and how many new businesses fail in the first 3 to 5 years, right? It's astonishing. And why is it? Oftentimes, it's because of cash flow. And what's the biggest thing that's going to happen to so many DTC brands as consumer spending stops, and if they start pulling back on ad spend? Cash flow. Right, you've got fixed costs, you've got overhead. If you don't have that volume of revenue coming in the door to facilitate your costs, you're going to be in a tough spot. So one other thing, what did I see? You guys just released in the DTC newsletter some extended credit on credit cards and things like that, right? It's like these are the kind of things you got to start preparing yourself for now if you do end up in a situation where you have to decrease your revenue and your cash flow.
And also scrutinize your expenses. Like there's no to it. That's something Sean Frank talked about on his podcast, like going to some of your SaaS providers even and trying to negotiate lower percentage points across the board. It's sort of time to really look at all your expenses, really make sure that you're scrutinizing them like appropriately and eliminating and lowering them wherever you can, right? Because it's going to take a tight ship potentially to get through these tighter times.
I think it's also it's looking, and Eric, you and I do this probably about once a month with DTC. It's as a business, it goes and says we go and say, okay, let's look at because sometimes you're so in the weeds, you kind of forget to look for the low hanging fruit, and it's one of those things where if you just kind of step back and say, oh man, if we just tweak this by 10%, that 10% goes straight to our bottom line. Straight profit. If we cut back on this, oh man, we've been spending this for 6 months and it hasn't resulted in any uplift of anything. Why are we doing it? Just cut it, and don't be scared to make those changes. And don't be scared to. I mean, a lot of people try to avoid that kind of stuff. I think those conversations because they suck. It can suck, especially if you're in a panic mode. But do that when the time is still good. That's the time to have those conversations. Make sure you're prepared.
Doesn't that speak to performance marketing, Jeff? Like that's how we run media, right? It's literally you do that on a campaign level, an ad set level, an ad level. It's really saying if it doesn't perform, it doesn't belong, and really not attaching ego. Like so many things that a brand is doing, they're doing it because they have a vision and they want to see that vision through, and you're kind of doing it for that reason. And maybe you want it to pay off down the road in many years to come. You might be forced to make the performance decision, which is to pause that thing, retain that cash, and actually funnel that cash to the things that are keeping your business alive, which, as a reminder, is profitably acquiring customers, right?
Wrong size, wrong color, didn't look right in the living room? There are hundreds of reasons your customers return products, but returns don't have to be goodbyes. They can be an opportunity to complete the shopping experience. Built exclusively for Shopify, Loop lets you create a delightful return experience to attract and retain more customers. By making it easy for your customers to find products they love, they'll come back again and again. See why thousands of Shopify brands like Allbirds, Chubbies, and Brooklinen trust Loop as their return partner at loopreturns.com/DTC.
So we mentioned first party data as this essential thing that brands have to focus on in order to weather the storm over the next few years. What are some other areas that we think are critical to brand success right now?
I think making sure you have the right offer. Making sure you have the right offer for your customers now, but also your customers in a recessionary environment. So if they need to pull in their purse strings, what are you offering them and how is it different than what they're willing to buy today? No problem.
I'm biased as a marketer, but I always lean towards become a better marketer, right? Become a better salesperson as your whole team, as your whole company, become more effective at selling your product. You're going to have to be, if previously there was 10 people who wanted to buy and now there's 6, you're going to have to be 40% more effective to come out even. And I think it's possible, right? I think every brand can improve the way in which they sell their products, and they just have to be willing to prioritize that.
That's copywriting, that's storytelling, that's all those things. That's persuasion, classic persuasion.
Yeah. Next thing I'd do is in times of lessened demand, I would start testing. I would do kind of a retesting of all the main channels that have worked for me in the past that maybe don't anymore. So a lot of people will run Facebook. It gets too expensive. They kind of go off Facebook on TikTok or whatever. So going back and testing the angles that used to work for you, testing the kind of stuff that worked when CPMs were lower. Because if CPMs do come down with a decrease in demand, you might actually see those work again. So that might just be low hanging fruit. You can just kind of knock off.
Next, suspend assumptions, right? We all have an assumption of terrible times that will guide your hand, right? So don't assume the worst. Let the data tell you if it's the worst, but until you see that, don't take action based on it.
I think that's great advice. And even us talking about a recession in this, I think the biggest part of a recession is like recession expectation or inflation expectation. It's like really the market is mental, right? And so is your business in a lot of ways, right? So if you're leading it from that mindset, it's going to affect you.
Another thing we should touch on is, on Twitter, on whatever. I mean, every marketer is sharing the same kind of studies that go back to the companies that spend during a recession come out 2 to 3x their competitors who stopped prior. The best example is that Post Kellogg's one. I think Post was the big cereal brand. They cut back during the Great Depression, and Kellogg's kept spending, and Kellogg's came out, I think, 250% more sales or something. And I think it's important to look at that and say, okay, is this the right thing for my business? It's not going to work for every business. Like Dave said, I mean, cash is king. If you are just going to hemorrhage money into a void, it's probably not for you. But if you're a large enough brand and you can say, hey, look, like, what's more important, us hitting, a break even for the next year and a half, or us losing a bit, but coming out way ahead of our competition? Because there's no question when recessions happen, opportunity increases. This is where all these major companies came from, is during recessionary times. That's how innovation happens. That's how growth happens. That's where ad costs go down. That's where consumers are looking for that next thing. They're spending more time on their phones, or, et cetera, et cetera. So, really looking at that study, reading these studies and saying, hey, is this right for me? Can I apply this to my business? How can I apply it to parts of my business? And seeing if you can thrive during a recession opposed to pull in and contract.
One more big one I wanted to mention was, if you're a new brand and you've grown quickly over the past 2 years, you've likely hired a bunch of people, you've brought on a bunch of onboarding, and it's worked because there's been a high demand and been enough revenue to sustain that business. When that tide shifts and your revenue comes down, you still have that fixed cost. You have to make a decision of either reducing your fixed cost or finding ways to keep that revenue up. And I think a lot of people are going to pull back on spend when they see, some indication of decline, perhaps with some assumptions that it's going to continue to get worse. And that right there is the starting point of how so many businesses fail, right? So the only solve that I can think of, I'm no expert, but a combination of finding ways to reduce costs, but also finding ways to keep your advertising going, keep the sales coming in the door. And that's where there are some sacrifices that can be made. Again, the easiest ones, in my opinion, come from self, come from ego. If you're willing to do away with some of your desires and actually focus on what your consumers want, and be willing to go with the flow, and especially if you're advertising on paid social or TikTok, it's all about the consumer.
Interesting. We're almost out of time here, but I just wanted to ask, I normally ask on the D2C podcast about if we gave you a $50K grant, what would you do it? How would you apply it to the business to see the biggest piece of growth? And I'm just curious from, Dave, like with the number of accounts that we run, if a brand were to come to us about, okay, I've got this surplus budget, where would you be putting it right now to prepare for the current times? Where would you putting $50,000 to see the biggest growth for a client?
That's a really good question. It's a terrible answer. It depends, right? It depends where they're at. And, like we said, if their email isn't tight, I would invest it all there. If their storefront isn't tight, I would invest in conversion rate optimization, right? So I would consult with someone to come in there and say, hey, if we're only converting at 2% on our traffic, we're going to need that to be 4, especially now more than ever, right? Going to push that to 5, push that to 6 if possible. And there are so many things that a brand can do that I'm always boggled that Shopify, if they're on Shopify, optimization is always the bottom of the list of things. It's always focusing on those ads, right? And focusing on tweaking that one word. And it's like, why we're missing the forest from the trees here when all that traffic is going to come to a site. So I'd say probably your back end email and your Shopify CRO. It's probably the most broad.
I got one. Just throw it in there. Uh, Aggressive creative testing. And I think again, there's so many brands that come in and they've had one creative or one type of creative it's been their success, and they've fallen off a cliff, and they're just trying to get that back. And the solution we use at Pilothouse is just you aggressively test creative. We're going to go test 200, 300 different ads to go find that next winner, because that you're, especially in today's data deficient world, it's the creative that's driving so much of our brand success. You find that right creative that resonates with the audience, and you're going to crush. And there's a million ways to do it with 50 grand.
Earlier, I mentioned ego, and I think a lot of brands are going to fail in a recession due to ego. And aggressive creative testing is it's the antithesis of ego, right? It's really just saying it's not about me, it's about the data, it's about the consumers. I'm going to let them vote with their dollars to tell me and to communicate to me what they want and what they're willing to buy, right? And so when you're aggressively creatively testing, you're willing to just take yourself out of it.
Kill your darlings, as a writer would say, right? You need to be willing to kill your darlings.
100%. Eric, a great example is again, I'll just use DTC because we're on the DTC podcast, but we cut our acquisition costs by about 65% with a new creative. And it's just, that's lasted for 3 months. That is massive in terms of the number of people we've been able to add to the list, which grows the business, which grows it all, and that's just from literally one creative. And we're always trying to find that one creative. So we're always testing. But when you do, it can just have it's not a forever solution, but it's a solution to get you that next lily pad.
Very cool. It makes me think of a point that we brought up earlier too, just about ways that you can kind of add value without detracting or asking too much of the customer. And it makes me think of what we're doing. And it's the first time we've really talked about it on the podcast, but we've actually started a second newsletter called the Daily CTA. And it actually right now, so when you subscribe for the D2C newsletter, you get an opportunity to also sign to our Daily CTA, which is it's a meta newsletter of sorts, where we're actually summarizing all the other best newsletter and blog stories out there into short point form hits. So you can actually subscribe to that now. First time we've even told our audience about it at dailycta.co. But that ability to sort of, by adding a new property in our funnel, we lowered our acquisition cost by 40% ostensibly, because now 40% of the people who opt into direct to consumer are on CTA as well.
Yeah, that's a really good lesson too. How do you take the spend you're already making and make it go further, right? And like that's exactly what we did. It's not like if we put DTC and the Daily CTA on the front of the newsletter, you're going to get way more, drop off, because people are like, I don't know, it's 2 newsletters. That seems like a lot, et cetera, et cetera. But if someone comes through same flow, so the front end cost for DTC customers is exactly the same, and then we add it on the back and say, hey, do you also want this? It's like it's standard order bump on a checkout on an e-commerce site, right? Or an upsell or a downsell or whatever. It's just it's purely additive at the end of the day. I mean, there's obviously downstream metrics, unsubscribe rates, et cetera. But, anything that brands can be doing to do that is hugely beneficial, Think about how you can make your dollars go further. That's it.
100%. I wanted to pin either Dave or Kyle down on this question a little bit further and posit a 50 grand scenario where you were actually asked to actually just split traffic among Facebook, TikTok, and call it the Google suite. So you could use 50,000, you could use 100,000. Let's use maybe even 100%. If and take like a neutral brand, like not it's a millennial brand. Let's call it housewares or something. What does that split look like in 22?
I'd go 50% Meta, which is Facebook, Instagram, 30% Google, 20% TikTok right now. Obviously with TikTok, big question, does TikTok work with your brand? If the answer is no, I wouldn't recommend you spend 20% of your budget on TikTok. But if yes, or you're in the early stages right now of testing, the reason I'd suggest putting money there, take your 50 grand and invest it in content creators, right? Right now, you need to get real TikToks. It's not even user-generated content. It is, in fact, TikToks, right? You need to find the creators who are able to make TikToks for your brand. And that also might mean internally, right? That might mean hiring someone internally to your company who just loves your product, who's willing to get out there and put themselves out there and jump around in the company and make it human, right? Talk to the people who work in your company, go to the warehouse and say, hey Joe, what are you working on today? That's the way that I'm seeing, and through conversations with other brands, and obviously your conversations, Eric, with DTC members, that's the kind of content that is thriving. And so invest your money there.
There's never been a better organic opportunity for people to sort of show people how the sausage is made, as you say. And, whether it's showing your factory, like you say, just asking funny questions to people who work at your company and recording it. Like, there's just so many different ways that you can kind of create that organic content. And it creates such a good proving ground for what filters up into ads as well. So I think that's a really salient point about TikTok. Nice. Maybe we'll check back in another 2 years. I know the plans are continue to grow massively. As we have both as Pilothouse and D2C. So we're going to kind of keep doubling down through the 2022, whatever it is. And we hope you guys come along with us. Thanks for coming on the podcast, guys. It was a lot of fun.
That was great.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you're not getting the D2C newsletter, you can subscribe for free at directtoconsumer.co. And if you want to learn more about Pilothouse's all-killer, no-filler services, take off to pilothouse.co. I'm Eric Dick, and this has been the D2C Podcast. We'll see you next time.